I'm afraid of you, she said. And what this lone cowboy did changed everything. On a night when lightning tore the prairie sky apart, 18-year-old Eliza Monroe made a choice that would either save her life or end it. Behind her, a stepfather who'd murdered her mother. Ahead, nothing but darkness and a whispered name. When she collapsed at a stranger's door, soaked in rain and terror, she had no idea the man inside would become the only person she could trust. This is the story of how fear became courage, and how one night in a storm rewrote two broken lives forever. If you want to see how far Eliza's journey takes her, stay until the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The rain came down like nails. Eliza Monroe pressed herself flat against the horse's neck, her fingers twisted so tightly in its mane that she couldn't feel them anymore. The animal beneath her was panicked, its hooves sliding in the mud with every desperate stride, but she didn't slow down. She couldn't. Behind her, somewhere in the churning darkness of the prairie, men were coming. Men with rifles and lanterns and orders to bring her back. Or worse, orders not to. Lightning split the sky, turning the world white for half a heartbeat. In that flash, Eliza saw it all. The endless flatland stretching out like a black ocean, the rain slashing sideways in silver sheets, the horse's wild eyes rolling back in fear. Then darkness swallowed everything again, and there was only the thunder, the drumming rain, and the pounding of hooves beneath her. She was 18 years old. She had no money, no map, no plan. All she had was a stolen horse, the clothes on her back, and a name her mother had whispered 3 nights before she died. Margaret Hale. Redstone Crossing. Find her, please. Eliza didn't know who Margaret Hale was. She didn't know where Redstone Crossing lay or how far she'd have to ride to reach it. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. If she stopped now, she would never leave that ranch alive. The storm had begun just after sunset, rolling in from the west with the kind of violence that made animals hide and smart people bolt their doors. Eliza had been waiting for it. She'd watched the clouds build all afternoon from the window of her room, the room her stepfather kept locked from the outside. And she'd known this was her chance, maybe her only chance. 3 days ago, her mother had died. The doctor said it was her heart. Her stepfather, Samuel Garrett, had nodded solemnly and accepted condolences from neighbors who didn't look too closely. But Eliza had seen the truth in her mother's final hours. The trembling hands, the gray skin, the way she couldn't keep water down. She'd seen the small brown bottle her stepfather kept locked in his desk, the one that smelled bitter and metallic when she'd finally broken in and uncorked it. Poison. He'd been poisoning her mother for months, maybe longer, slow and careful, so no one would suspect. And now that Catherine Monroe was dead, now that the ranch and the land and everything her mother had owned passed to Samuel Garrett, there was only one thing left standing in his way. Eliza. The day after the funeral, he'd told her the news. He'd been drinking. He always drank after dinner, and he'd called her into his study with that false gentleness he used when he wanted something. Sit down, Eliza. She'd remained standing. He'd smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You're a woman now, 18 years old. Your mother would have wanted you taken care of. I can take care of myself. No, he'd said quietly, and the smile disappeared. You can't, but Thomas Burdock can. The name hit her like a fist. Thomas Burdock was a cattle broker from Millerton, a man twice her age with a reputation for cruelty and a ranch that swallowed up every piece of land around it. He'd been circling her stepfather for years, making offers, pressing deals. And now, apparently, he'd made an offer for her. You're marrying him in 2 weeks, Samuel had said. I've already agreed to the terms. Eliza had stared at him, her heart turning to ice in her chest. You sold me. I secured your future. You murdered my mother, and now you're selling me like livestock. His hand had moved so fast she didn't see it coming. The slap knocked her sideways into the chair, her ear ringing, her vision blurring. When she looked up, his face was cold and empty. You'll marry Thomas Burdock, he'd said quietly, or you'll find yourself in the same grave as your mother. Do you understand me? She'd understood. That night, she'd begun to plan. Now, 3 days later, she was alone in a storm with a stolen horse and no idea if she'd live to see morning. The horse stumbled, nearly going down, and Eliza bit back a scream. She hauled on the reins, trying to keep the animal upright, but the mud was too deep and the rain too heavy. They were slowing down. The horse was exhausted, and so was she. She risked a glance over her shoulder. Nothing. Just darkness and rain. But that didn't mean they'd stopped. Samuel Garrett didn't give up. And he had men, ranch hands loyal to his money, men who wouldn't ask questions. If they caught her out here, in the middle of nowhere, no one would ever know what happened. The thought made her dig her heels into the horse's flanks, urging it forward. "Come on," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Please, just a little farther." But farther to where, she didn't know. North, her mother had said. Redstone Crossing was north. But the prairie was endless, and the storm had swallowed every landmark. She could be riding in circles for all she knew. Another flash of lightning. This time she saw something. A shape, low and dark against the horizon. A building. Hope flared in her chest, sharp and desperate. She turned the horse toward it, urging the animal into a stumbling run. The structure came clearer as they closed the distance. A small cabin, maybe a line shack for route riders, with a thin curl of smoke rising from a chimney. Someone was inside. Eliza's hope twisted into fear. Out here, alone, she had no way of knowing if whoever lived in that cabin would help her or hurt her. She had no weapons, no leverage, no money to offer. She was a girl in a stolen dress on a stolen horse. And if the person inside decided to turn her over to Samuel Garrett, there was nothing she could do to stop them. But the alternative was freezing to death in the rain. She pulled the horse to a stop 20 feet from the cabin door. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the reins. The windows glowed faintly with firelight, warm and impossibly distant. For a long moment, she just sat there, rain streaming down her face, her body shaking with cold and exhaustion. Then the door opened. A man stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the light. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a rifle held loosely in one hand. He didn't point it at her, but he didn't lower it either. "Who's there?" His voice was low, rough, cautious. Eliza opened her mouth to answer, but no sound came out. Her throat was too tight, her chest too frozen. The man stepped forward, squinting through the rain. When he saw her, soaked, shivering, barely clinging to the horse, his posture changed. He lowered the rifle and moved toward her. "Jesus," he muttered. "How long have you been out here?" She tried to answer again, but the words wouldn't come. Her hand slipped on the reins. The man reached her just as she started to fall. He caught her, one arm around her waist, steadying her against the horse. "Easy," he said quietly. "I've got you." Eliza looked down at him, her vision swimming. He had dark hair plastered to his forehead, sharp features shadowed by exhaustion, and eyes that held something she hadn't seen in a long time. Kindness. Her voice cracked. "I'm sorry. I didn't know where else to go." "It's all right." He glanced at the horse, then back at her. "Can you stand?" She nodded, even though she wasn't sure. He helped her down from the saddle, his grip firm but careful. When her feet hit the ground, her knees buckled, and he caught her again. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you inside." He led her toward the cabin, one hand on her elbow to keep her upright. The horse followed, too tired to run. When they reached the door, the man paused and looked at her. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly. "But I need to know. Is someone chasing you?" Eliza hesitated, then she nodded. The man's jaw tightened. He glanced out at the storm, scanning the darkness, then nodded once. "All right, get inside. I'll put the horse in the lean-to." He disappeared into the rain, leading the horse away. Eliza stood in the doorway, shaking so hard her teeth rattled, staring into the small cabin. It was simple. A single room with a fireplace, a narrow bed, a table and 2 chairs. Everything was clean and spare, the kind of place that belonged to someone who didn't stay anywhere long. But it was warm, and it was dry. And right now, that was enough. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The heat from the fire hit her like a wall, and suddenly her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. She sank down onto the floor, her back against the door, her arms wrapped around herself. For the first time in 3 days, she let herself breathe. The man came back a few minutes later, rain dripping from his coat. He paused when he saw her on the floor, then crossed the room and crouched down in front of her. "You need to get out of those clothes," he said. "You're freezing." Eliza stiffened, her eyes going wide. He held up his hands. "I'm not—" "I'll turn around. There's a blanket on the bed. Wrap yourself in it and sit by the fire. I'll heat some water for coffee." He stood and turned his back, moving to the stove without another word. Eliza watched him for a moment, her heart still pounding. Then, slowly, she pushed herself to her feet. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons of her dress. They were too cold, too stiff. But she managed to peel the soaked fabric away. She wrapped herself in the heavy wool blanket from the bed and sank down in front of the fire, pulling the blanket tight around her shoulders. The man glanced over his shoulder, saw that she was covered, and nodded. He poured water into a kettle and set it on the stove, then pulled out a tin of coffee and 2 chipped mugs. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled. The rain hammered against the roof. Eliza stared into the flames, trying to stop shaking, trying to think. "What's your name?" She looked up. The man was watching her, his expression unreadable. "Eliza," she said quietly. He nodded. "I'm Caleb Ward." "Thank you," she whispered, "for letting me in." Caleb shrugged. Anyone would have. Eliza thought of her stepfather, of Thomas Burdock, of all the men who'd looked at her like property and never once saw a person. "No," she said. "They wouldn't." Caleb didn't argue. He poured the coffee when it was ready and handed her a mug. She wrapped her hands around it, savoring the warmth. "Who's chasing you?" he asked. Eliza hesitated. She didn't know this man. She didn't know if she could trust him, but she was so tired of carrying the weight alone. "My stepfather," she said quietly. "Samuel Garrett. He killed my mother, and now he's trying to sell me to a man named Thomas Burdock." Caleb's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Something cold. "Sell you." "A marriage arrangement. But it's the same thing." She looked down at her hands. "I ran. I took one of the horses and I ran. If he catches me, he'll—" Her voice broke. "I don't know what he'll do." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he set his mug down and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Where were you headed?" "North. There's a place called Redstone Crossing. My mother told me to find a woman there. Margaret Hale. She said Margaret would help me." "Redstone Crossing." Caleb nodded slowly. "That's 2 days' ride from here, maybe 3 in this weather." Eliza's chest tightened. "Do you know it?" "I've been through it a few times. It's a small town, quiet. If this Margaret Hale is there, you'll find her." He paused. "But you can't make that ride alone. Not with men hunting you." "I don't have a choice." "No." Caleb straightened. "But I do." Eliza looked at him confused. He met her gaze, his expression steady. "I'll take you there. Redstone Crossing. I'll make sure you get to this Margaret Hale." Eliza stared at him, her heart pounding. "Why?" "Because you need help," Caleb said simply, "and because no one should have to run alone." Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." "No," Caleb agreed, "but that doesn't matter." For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then Eliza nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Caleb stood and moved to the window, peering out into the storm. "We'll leave at first light. The rain should break by then. Get some rest." "What about you?" "I'll keep watch." "Caleb, rest," he said quietly. "You're safe here. I promise." Eliza wanted to argue, but exhaustion was dragging her down like a stone. She curled up on the floor in front of the fire, the blanket wrapped around her, and closed her eyes. For the first time in 3 days, she slept without nightmares. Eliza woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The warmth of the fire, the rough wool blanket against her skin, the quiet crackle of wood burning. None of it belonged to the locked room at her stepfather's ranch. Then memory crashed back in, and she sat up fast, her heart hammering. Caleb stood at the stove with his back to her, turning strips of bacon in a cast-iron skillet. Morning light filtered through the window, weak and gray, but the storm had passed. The rain had stopped sometime in the night, leaving behind only the drip of water from the eaves and the soft whisper of wind across the prairie. He glanced over his shoulder when he heard her move. You're awake. Eliza pulled the blanket tighter around herself, suddenly aware that her dress still hung drying by the fire. How long did I sleep? Long enough. He plated the bacon and brought it to the table along with 2 tin cups of coffee. Your clothes are almost dry. We'll leave in an hour. She stood slowly, testing her legs. Her whole body ached. Muscles she didn't know she had were screaming from the hard ride and the cold. But she was alive. That was more than she'd expected last night. Caleb gestured to the table. Eat. It's a long ride to Redstone Crossing. Eliza hesitated, then moved to the table and sat down. The bacon was crispy and hot, the coffee strong and bitter. She ate quickly, trying not to think about how hungry she'd been, or how long it had been since she'd had a real meal. At her stepfather's ranch, she'd been eating alone in her room for weeks, picking at whatever the housekeeper brought her. Caleb sat across from her, sipping his coffee and watching the window. He didn't talk much, didn't ask questions, didn't push. There was something careful about him, like a man who'd learned to keep his distance from other people's pain. Why do you live out here alone? The question slipped out before Eliza could stop it. Caleb's eyes shifted to her, unreadable. I ride routes for the cattle companies. Check fences, move strays, keep an eye on things. It's solitary work. Do you like it that way? He was quiet for a moment. I used to have a family, a wife and a daughter. They died 4 years ago. Fever took them both in the same week. His voice was flat, factual, like he was reporting something that had happened to someone else. After that, I didn't see much point in staying anywhere that reminded me of them. So I ride. Eliza's chest tightened. I'm sorry. Caleb shrugged. It's been 4 years. You learn to live with it. He drained his coffee and stood. Finish eating. I'll saddle the horses. He pulled on his coat and went outside, leaving Eliza alone with the weight of his words. She understood that kind of grief, the kind that carved you hollow and made everything else seem distant and unimportant. She'd felt it when her mother died, when she realized she was truly alone in a house with a man who wanted her dead or gone. She finished the bacon and dressed quickly, pulling on her clothes even though they were still slightly damp. They smelled like wood smoke and rain, but they were better than the blanket. When she stepped outside, Caleb had both horses saddled and ready. Her stolen mare looked better after a night's rest, though her eyes still held that wild edge of fear. She'll hold up, Caleb said, reading her expression. But we'll need to take it slow. The ground's soft from the rain, and if your stepfather's men are still out looking, we don't want to leave an easy trail. Eliza nodded and climbed into the saddle. Her body protested every movement, but she gritted her teeth and pushed through it. Caleb swung up onto his own horse, a sturdy dun gelding with the calm disposition of an animal used to long, lonely miles, and turned north. They rode in silence for the first hour. The prairie stretched out around them, endless and empty under a low gray sky. The storm had turned everything to mud, and their horses picked their way carefully through the soft ground. Eliza kept glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see riders on the horizon, but there was nothing. Just grass and sky and the relentless emptiness of the land. Tell me about Margaret Hale, Caleb said eventually. Eliza looked at him, grateful for the distraction. I don't know much. My mother only mentioned her once, right before she died. She said Margaret was her closest friend, that they'd grown up together before my mother married my father. Your real father? Yes. He died when I was 10, a riding accident. Eliza's voice went quiet. After that, my mother was alone. Samuel Garrett worked as the ranch foreman. He was kind to her at first, helpful. She married him 2 years later. She swallowed hard. I think she was lonely. I think she wanted someone to help carry the weight. But Samuel didn't want to help. He wanted to own. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. He started small, Eliza continued. Little rules. Where my mother could go, who she could see. He let go of the ranch hands my father had trusted and brought in his own men. He took over the finances, and then my mother started getting sick. Just a little at first, headaches, tiredness, but it got worse over the months. The doctor couldn't figure out what was wrong. But you did. Eliza nodded. I found the poison 3 days before she died. A bottle in his desk drawer. I didn't know what it was at first, but it smelled wrong, bitter, like metal and chemicals. I looked it up in one of my father's old books. Arsenic. Her voice shook. He'd been poisoning her for months, slow enough that no one would suspect. Caleb's knuckles went white on the reins. Did you confront him? No, I was too afraid. And I thought if I could just get my mother away from him, if I could get her to a real doctor, maybe she'd survive. But she died before I could do anything. Tears burned at Eliza's eyes, but she blinked them back. The last thing she said to me was Margaret's name. She told me to find her. She said Margaret would know what to do. Then that's what we'll do. They rode on through the morning, the horses settling into a steady rhythm. The land began to change as they moved north, the flat prairie giving way to gentle hills and scattered groves of cottonwood trees. Caleb seemed to know the way without needing to think about it, guiding them along old cattle trails and avoiding the main roads where they might be spotted. Around midday, they stopped to rest the horses by a narrow creek swollen with storm runoff. Caleb filled their canteens while Eliza walked along the bank, stretching her sore legs. The silence out here was different from the silence at her stepfather's ranch. There, silence had meant danger. Meant Samuel was thinking, planning, tightening his control. Out here, silence was just space, room to breathe. Eliza, she turned. Caleb was standing by the horses, his eyes fixed on something in the distance behind them. What is it? Riders, 3, maybe 4, about 2 miles back. Eliza's blood went cold. Are they following us? Can't tell yet, but we're not waiting to find out. He moved quickly, tightening the saddle girths and checking the horses. We need to move, now. They mounted and rode hard, pushing the horses into a canter across the softer ground. Eliza risked a glance back and saw them, dark shapes moving across the prairie, too far away to identify, but close enough to be a threat. Her heart hammered in her chest. They're getting closer, she said, her voice tight. I know. Caleb's eyes scanned the landscape ahead. There's a ravine about a mile north. If we can reach it before they close the distance, we can lose them in the brush. They pushed the horses harder, mud flying from their hooves. Eliza's mare was struggling, her breathing labored, but the animal kept going. Behind them, the riders were gaining. She could see them more clearly now. 4 men on strong horses, riding with purpose. Caleb, I see them. Just hold on. The ravine appeared ahead, a dark slash in the earth lined with scrub oak and wild plum. Caleb led them down into it at a reckless pace, the horses sliding on the steep slope. Eliza clung to the saddle, her heart in her throat, and then they were in the bottom, surrounded by thick brush and the cool shadows of the trees. Caleb dismounted fast and pulled both horses deeper into the cover. He pressed a finger to his lips, signaling Eliza to stay quiet. She slid down from the saddle, her legs shaking, and crouched beside him in the undergrowth. Above them, on the prairie, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder. Eliza held her breath. Through the tangle of branches, she could see the riders approaching. 4 men, just as Caleb had said. They slowed when they reached the ravine, scanning the ground, looking for tracks in the mud. One of them was Jake Calloway, one of Samuel's most loyal ranch hands. Eliza recognized his scarred face and the way he sat in the saddle, slouched and mean. Tracks go down here, Jake called to the others. Another man rode to the edge and peered into the ravine. Could be. Or they could have kept going north and were wasting time. Garrett said bring her back alive if we can, dead if we can't. Jake spat into the dirt. Girl's not worth dying for, but she's worth a week's pay if we find her. The words hit Eliza like a punch. Samuel hadn't even pretended she mattered. She was just another problem to be solved, another piece of property to be recovered or discarded. Caleb's hand closed gently around her wrist, steadying her. The men argued for another minute, then one of them made the decision. Split up. Jake, you and Miller check the ravine. Me and Tom will keep heading north. If she's down there, flush her out. If not, catch up with us in an hour. 2 of the riders moved on, disappearing over the rise. Jake and the man called Miller dismounted and started down into the ravine, their boots sliding in the mud. Caleb's grip tightened on Eliza's wrist. He leaned close and whispered so quietly she almost didn't hear him. Stay here. Don't move. Don't make a sound. Before she could protest, he was moving, slipping through the brush like a shadow. Eliza pressed herself flat against the cold earth, her heart hammering so loud she was sure the men would hear it. Jake and Miller were close now, maybe 20 feet away, pushing through the undergrowth with their rifles ready. Miller was complaining, his voice carrying easily in the quiet. "This is a waste of time. Girl probably drowned in the storm." "Garrett don't think so," Jake said. "And Garrett's paying." They moved deeper into the ravine, away from where Eliza was hiding. She watched them disappear into the brush, every muscle in her body coiled tight with fear. Then, somewhere to her left, she heard a sound, a soft whistle, like a bird call. Jake stopped. "You hear that?" Probably just the crack of a branch, and then Caleb was there, stepping out from behind a tree. He had his rifle leveled at Jake's chest, his expression cold and calm. "That's far enough." Jake spun, raising his own rifle, but Caleb was faster. "Drop it, both of you." Miller's hands went up immediately, his rifle clattering to the ground. But Jake hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "You're making a mistake, friend. That girl's a runaway. We're just bringing her home." "No," Caleb said quietly. "You're hunting her. There's a difference. She belongs to Samuel Garrett. He's her legal guardian. She's 18. She doesn't belong to anyone." Caleb's voice was flat, final. "Now drop the rifle and get back on your horses. Tell Garrett you lost her trail. Tell him she's gone. And don't come looking again." Jake's face twisted with anger. "You don't know what you're getting into." "Yes," Caleb said. "I do." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then Jake slowly lowered his rifle and set it on the ground. He straightened, his hands raised, his eyes burning with rage. "This isn't over." "It is for today," Caleb gestured with his rifle. "Now go." Jake and Miller backed away, moving carefully through the brush. When they reached their horses, they mounted without another word and rode back up out of the ravine. Caleb didn't lower his rifle until they were out of sight. Then he turned and found Eliza standing behind him, her face pale. "Are you all right?" She nodded, even though she wasn't sure. "You could have killed them." "I could have, but that would have brought every man Garrett's got down on us." Caleb lowered the rifle and moved to the horses. "This way they'll go back and report you're gone. It buys us time." "Time for what?" "To get you to Redstone Crossing before they regroup." He checked the saddles, then looked at her. "Can you ride?" Eliza's legs felt like water, but she nodded. "Yes." They rode hard for the rest of the afternoon, pushing north through rolling hills and scattered timber. The land opened up again as evening approached, revealing a wide valley with a small town nestled at its center. Caleb pulled his horse to a stop on a low rise overlooking the valley and pointed. "Redstone Crossing." Eliza's breath caught. The town was small, maybe 24 buildings clustered around a single dirt road, but it looked solid and real. Smoke rose from chimneys, and she could see people moving between the buildings, going about their lives. After 3 days of running and fear, it looked like safety. "How do we find Margaret Hale?" she asked. "We ask." Caleb nudged his horse forward. "Small town like this, everyone knows everyone. We'll find her." They rode down into the valley as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The town grew larger as they approached, and Eliza could make out details now. A general store, a blacksmith's forge, a small church at the far end of the street. People stopped to watch them ride past, curious but not unfriendly. Caleb pulled up in front of the general store and dismounted. An older man sat on the porch, smoking a pipe, and watching the street with the patient air of someone who had nowhere else to be. "Evening," Caleb said. The man nodded. "Evening. You folks passing through?" "Looking for someone, actually, a woman named Margaret Hale. You know her?" The man's eyes sharpened with interest. "Margaret? Sure. She runs the boarding house at the end of the street, the big white house with the green shutters." He looked at Eliza, taking in her tired face and mud-stained clothes. "Is she expecting you?" "Not exactly," Caleb said, "but it's important." The man nodded slowly and pointed with his pipe. "End of the street, like I said. Can't miss it." They thanked him and rode on. The boarding house was exactly where he'd said it would be. A large, well-kept house with a wide front porch and flowers blooming in window boxes. Warm light glowed from the windows, and Eliza could smell bread baking. Caleb dismounted and helped Eliza down. Her legs nearly gave out and he steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "This is it," he said quietly. Eliza looked up at the house, her heart pounding. This was what her mother had wanted. This was the end of the run. But standing here now, about to knock on a stranger's door and ask for help, she felt more afraid than she had facing down Jake and his rifle. "What if she doesn't believe me?" Eliza whispered. "What if she doesn't remember my mother?" Caleb met her eyes. "Then we'll figure something else out. But you came this far, Eliza. Don't stop now." She took a breath and nodded. Together they climbed the porch steps, and Caleb knocked on the door. Footsteps inside. Then the door opened, and a woman stood there, backlit by lamplight. She was in her 40s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp, intelligent eyes. She looked at Caleb first, then at Eliza, and something shifted in her expression. "Can I help you?" Eliza's voice came out small and scared. "Are you Margaret Hale?" "I am." "My name is Eliza Monroe. My mother was Catherine Monroe." She swallowed hard. "Before she died, she told me to find you. She said you would help me." Margaret's face went very still. She stared at Eliza for a long moment, and then her eyes filled with tears. "Catherine's daughter," she whispered. "Oh, my dear girl, come inside, both of you. Come inside right now." She stepped back, ushering them into a warm, brightly lit hallway that smelled of bread and lavender. The door closed behind them, shutting out the cold and the fear and the endless prairie. For the first time in days, Eliza felt something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. Margaret Hale didn't ask questions right away. She led them through the boarding house to a private sitting room at the back, settled Eliza into a chair by the fire, and brought tea and warm bread without a word. Only after Eliza had eaten something and the color had started to return to her face did Margaret pull up a chair across from her and take her hands. "Tell me everything," she said quietly. So Eliza did. She told Margaret about her father's death, about Samuel Garrett's slow takeover of the ranch, about her mother's illness and the brown bottle of poison. She told her about Thomas Burdock and the forced marriage, about stealing the horse and running through the storm. Her voice shook when she described finding Caleb's cabin and the riders in the ravine, but she pushed through it. By the time she finished, Margaret's face was pale and her jaw was set hard. "Catherine," Margaret whispered, "I should have known. I should have seen it." "You couldn't have," Eliza said. He kept her isolated. She stopped writing letters, stopped visiting town. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. Margaret stood and paced to the window, her hands clasped tight. "Your mother and I grew up together. We were closer than sisters. When she married your father, I was so happy for her. He was a good man, and he loved her truly. But after he died," she shook her head. "I saw her at his funeral. She looked so lost. Samuel Garrett was there, playing the concerned foreman, and I remember thinking he watched her the way a wolf watches a wounded deer. But I lived 3 days' ride away, and by the time I heard she'd married him, it was already done." "She mentioned you in her letters," Eliza said. "Before Samuel made her stop writing, she said you were the only person who'd ever truly understood her." Margaret turned, tears on her cheeks. "And I failed her. I let her disappear into that man's control, and now she's dead." "You didn't fail her," Eliza said firmly. "She wanted me to find you because she trusted you, because she knew you'd help me when no one else would." Caleb, who'd been standing quietly by the door, spoke up. "The question is what happens now. Garrett's men followed us this far. They'll report back that they lost the trail, but Garrett's not going to give up. He's got too much to lose." Margaret wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. "Then we make sure he loses it all. Eliza, do you have any proof of what he did?" "The poison bottle. I took it from his desk before I ran. It's in my saddlebag." Margaret's eyes went sharp. "That's evidence, real evidence. With that and your testimony, we can bring this to the sheriff." "Will he listen?" Eliza asked. "Samuel Garrett owns half the county. He has money and influence." "Sheriff Holland is a good man," Margaret said. "He's not perfect, but he's honest, and he doesn't like bullies. If we present him with the facts, he'll act on them." She looked at Caleb. "How much of a head start do we have?" "A day, maybe 2. Garrett's men will need time to regroup and figure out where we went, but once they do, they'll come here, and they won't come polite." Margaret nodded slowly. "Then we need to move fast. Eliza, you'll stay here tonight. Get some real rest. Tomorrow morning, we'll go to the sheriff together. Eliza felt the weight on her chest lighten just slightly. For the first time since her mother died, she wasn't alone. That night, Margaret gave her a proper room with a real bed, clean sheets, and a lock on the door that Eliza could control herself. She slept deeply, exhausted down to her bones. And when she woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the window and the smell of bacon and eggs drifted up from the kitchen. She dressed in clean clothes Margaret had provided, a simple blue dress that fit reasonably well, and went downstairs. Caleb was already at the kitchen table, eating breakfast and talking quietly with Margaret. He looked up when Eliza entered, and something in his expression eased. "Morning?" "Morning." Eliza sat down and Margaret slid a plate in front of her. "Eat up," Margaret said. "We're going to see the sheriff in an hour." Eliza's stomach clenched, but she forced herself to eat. The food was good, better than anything she'd had in months, but it sat heavy in her stomach. When they finished, Margaret retrieved the poison bottle from Eliza's saddlebag, wrapped it carefully in cloth, and tucked it into her handbag. "Ready?" she asked. Eliza nodded, even though she wasn't sure. The three of them walked down the main street of Redstone Crossing, drawing curious looks from the townspeople. The sheriff's office was a small building near the center of town, with a single jail cell visible through a barred window. Margaret knocked once and pushed the door open. Sheriff Tom Holland sat behind a scarred wooden desk, reading through a stack of papers. He was a man in his 50s with gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. He looked up when they entered, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to attention when he saw Margaret. "Margaret, wasn't expecting you this morning." "Tom, we need to talk. This is Eliza Monroe and Caleb Ward. Eliza has something to report, and it's serious." Holland set down his papers and gestured to the chairs in front of his desk. "All right, have a seat and tell me what's going on." Eliza sat down, her hands clasped tight in her lap. For a moment she couldn't find her voice. Then Caleb's hand settled gently on her shoulder, and she took a breath. "My stepfather, Samuel Garrett, murdered my mother, and now he's trying to force me into a marriage to cover it up." Holland's eyebrows rose, but he didn't interrupt. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Monroe. You'd better start from the beginning." So she did. She told him everything. The same story she'd told Margaret, but with more details this time. She described her mother's symptoms, the way they'd worsened over months, the doctor's confusion. She told him about finding the poison and about Samuel's threat after the funeral. When she was done, Margaret pulled the wrapped bottle from her handbag and set it on the desk. "This is the poison Eliza found in Garrett's desk. Arsenic, if I'm not mistaken." Holland unwrapped the bottle carefully and held it up to the light. His expression was grim. "This is serious, all right, but I need more than a bottle and your word, Miss Monroe. No offense, but Garrett's a powerful man. If I'm going to move against him, I need evidence that'll hold up." "What about an exhumation?" Margaret said. "Catherine Monroe's only been dead a week. If arsenic was used over a long period, it'll still be in her system. A proper autopsy would prove it." Holland was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then he nodded. "That could work. But I'll need a judge's order, and that'll take time. A few days, at least." "We might not have a few days," Caleb said. "Garrett's men were tracking us yesterday. They know we came this direction. It's only a matter of time before they figure out we're here." "Then I'll send word to Judge Carson in Millerton," Holland said. "He's fair, and he doesn't like Garrett any more than I do. But until I get that order, there's not much I can do officially." He looked at Eliza. "You're safe here for now. I'll keep an eye out for any of Garrett's men, and if they show up causing trouble, I'll deal with them." "Thank you, Sheriff." Holland nodded. "In the meantime, you stay close to Margaret's place. Don't go wandering around alone. And if anything happens, you come straight to me." They left the sheriff's office with a mixture of relief and anxiety. Holland believed them, which was more than Eliza had dared hope for. But the waiting was going to be hard, and the knowledge that Samuel's men were somewhere out there, looking for her, made her skin crawl. The next 2 days passed in uneasy quiet. Eliza stayed at the boarding house, helping Margaret with chores and trying to keep her mind occupied. Caleb remained in town, sleeping in the boarding house's barn and keeping watch. He didn't say much, but Eliza noticed the way his eyes constantly scanned the street. the way his hand never strayed far from his rifle. On the third morning, everything changed. Eliza was helping Margaret hang laundry in the backyard when she heard the sound of horses. A lot of them. She turned toward the front of the house just as Caleb came running around the corner. "They're here," he said, his voice tight. "6 riders just came into town. Samuel Garrett's leading them." Eliza's blood turned to ice. "He came himself?" "Looks like it. They're heading for the sheriff's office right now." Margaret dropped the sheet she was holding. "Stay here, both of you. I'll go see what's happening." "Margaret, stay here," she repeated firmly, and hurried toward the front of the house. Eliza and Caleb exchanged a look, then followed at a distance, staying out of sight. They watched from the corner of the building as Margaret crossed the street toward the sheriff's office, where 6 horses stood tied to the hitching post. Through the window, Eliza could see Samuel Garrett standing in front of Sheriff Holland's desk, his face red with anger. "I want my stepdaughter returned to me immediately," Samuel was saying, his voice loud enough to carry through the door. "She's a runaway and a thief. She stole one of my horses and ran off 3 nights ago. I have every right to take her home." "She's 18, Holland said calmly. "She's of legal age. She can go where she pleases. She's disturbed, unstable. Her mother just died, and she's not in her right mind. I'm her legal guardian, and I'm responsible for her welfare." "That's interesting," Holland said, "because she tells a very different story. She says you murdered her mother and tried to sell her into a forced marriage." Samuel's face went white, then red. "That's a lie. A malicious, insane lie." "Maybe, but I've requested an exhumation order for Catherine Monroe's body. If there's nothing to hide, the autopsy will clear you. If there is something to hide—" Holland let the sentence hang. Samuel's hands clenched into fists. "You have no right." "I have every right when there's probable cause to suspect a crime." Holland stood, his hand resting on his gun belt. "Now, I'm going to ask you nicely to leave town, Mr. Garrett. Your stepdaughter is under my protection. If you try to take her by force, I'll arrest you and every man you brought with you." For a moment, Eliza thought Samuel might actually leave. Then his expression changed, hardening into something cold and calculating. He turned and walked out of the office, his men following, but he didn't mount his horse and ride away. Instead, he stood in the middle of the street and raised his voice. "Eliza Monroe, I know you're here. Come out and face me." Eliza's heart hammered. Beside her, Caleb's hand closed around her arm. "Don't." "Come out now," Samuel shouted, "or I'll tear this town apart until I find you." Margaret appeared in the street, positioning herself between Samuel and the boarding house. "You need to leave, Samuel Garrett, right now." Samuel's eyes fixed on her, and recognition dawned. "Margaret Hale. I should have known. Catherine's old friend. Did you put these lies in my stepdaughter's head?" "The only lies here are the ones you've been telling for 2 years," Margaret said coldly. "Everyone in this town knows what kind of man you are." "And what kind of man is that?" "The kind who poisons his wife and sells his stepdaughter like livestock." The words hung in the air, sharp and clear. People had started gathering on the street now, drawn by the commotion. Shopkeepers stood in doorways, women paused with their baskets, men stopped their work to watch. Samuel's face twisted with rage. "You have no proof." "Yes," said a voice behind him. "She does." Samuel spun. Eliza stood at the corner of the boarding house, Caleb beside her. Her legs were shaking, but her voice was steady. "I have the poison you used," she said. "The bottle from your desk, arsenic, the same poison that killed my mother." Samuel went very still. "You're lying." "Am I?" Eliza took a step forward, her fear turning to anger. "You kept it locked in your desk drawer, the 3rd drawer down, behind the ledgers. A brown glass bottle with no label. You added it to her tea every evening for months. I watched you do it, even though I didn't understand what I was seeing until it was too late." "You're insane. Grief has driven you mad." "Maybe grief has driven me to finally tell the truth." Eliza's voice rose, carrying across the street to every person watching. "You murdered my mother so you could take her ranch. And when I became a problem, you tried to sell me to Thomas Burdock to get me out of the way. But I won't disappear quietly. I won't let you bury the truth the way you buried her." Samuel's hand moved toward his gun. Caleb was faster. He stepped in front of Eliza, his rifle leveled at Samuel's chest. "Don't!" The 5 men with Samuel moved their hands toward their own weapons, but Sheriff Holland was there now, his gun drawn, flanked by 2 deputies who'd emerged from nearby buildings. "That's enough," Holland said sharply. "Everybody calm down and nobody draw." The street went silent. Eliza could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of 100 eyes watching. Samuel's face was a mask of fury, but he slowly raised his hands away from his gun. "This isn't over." "Yes," Eliza said quietly. "It is. The sheriff's requested an exhumation. They're going to examine my mother's body. When they find the arsenic, everyone will know what you did. Your money won't protect you. Your influence won't save you. You're going to pay for what you did to her." "You little—" "Enough," Holland cut in. "Mr. Garrett, you and your men are leaving, now. And if I see any of you in Redstone Crossing again before the judge makes his ruling, I'll arrest you for disturbing the peace and threatening a witness. Are we clear?" Samuel stared at Eliza, his eyes full of hate. Then he turned and mounted his horse. His men did the same. "This isn't over," he said again, "not by a long way." He wheeled his horse and rode out of town, his men following. The thunder of hoofbeats faded into the distance, and slowly, the tension in the street began to ease. Eliza's knees gave out. Caleb caught her before she fell, his arms steady around her. "I've got you." "I did it," she whispered. "I actually did it." "You did," he said quietly. "You stood up to him. You told the truth." Margaret hurried over, her face pale but proud. "You were so brave, Eliza." "I was terrified." "Brave and terrified aren't opposites, dear girl. They go hand in hand." Margaret looked at Sheriff Holland. "What happens now?" "Now we wait for the judge's order," Holland said. "Could be a few more days, but after that little scene, I'd say we've got plenty of witnesses who'll testify to Garrett's character." He looked at Eliza. "You all right, Miss Monroe?" Eliza nodded, even though she was shaking. "I'm all right." "Good, because you just made a very dangerous enemy. But you also made it a hell of a lot easier to build a case against him." Holland tipped his hat. "Stay safe and stay close." He walked back to his office, and slowly the crowd dispersed, people returning to their lives but casting glances back at Eliza. Some curious, some sympathetic, some admiring. Margaret took Eliza's arm. "Come inside. You need to sit down." They went back to the boarding house, and Margaret made tea while Caleb checked the doors and windows. Eliza sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around the warm cup, trying to process what had just happened. She'd faced Samuel Garrett in front of the whole town. She'd accused him publicly, and he hadn't been able to deny it convincingly. For the first time since her mother died, she felt like she had power. But she also knew Samuel wouldn't give up. Men like him never did. "He'll try something else," she said quietly. "He won't just walk away." Caleb sat down across from her. "Probably not. But he's been exposed now. Everyone in this town heard what you said. If anything happens to you, he's the first person they'll suspect. That won't stop him if he's desperate enough." "No," Caleb agreed. "But we'll be ready." Margaret set down her own tea and looked between them. "There's something else we need to consider. Even if the autopsy proves arsenic poisoning, proving Samuel administered it might be difficult. We need more than the bottle and Eliza's testimony." "What about the housekeeper?" Eliza said suddenly. "Mrs. Chen. She worked at the ranch for years. She would have seen things, noticed things. If anyone knows the truth besides me, it's her." Margaret nodded slowly. "Do you think she'd be willing to testify?" "I don't know. She was always kind to me, but she was also afraid of Samuel. He controlled everyone on that ranch." Eliza paused. "But maybe if she knew she'd be protected, that she wouldn't be alone." "Then we find her," Caleb said. "We bring her here and we ask." "That means going back near the ranch," Margaret warned. "It's dangerous." "Everything about this is dangerous," Caleb said. "But if Mrs. Chen's testimony could seal the case against Garrett, it's worth the risk." Eliza looked at him, this quiet man who'd given her shelter and protection and asked for nothing in return. "Why are you doing this? You could have left me at the cabin and gone back to your life. Why are you still here?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Because no one should have to fight alone. And because what Garrett did to your mother, what he tried to do to you, it's the kind of evil that needs to be stopped. His eyes met hers. But mostly because you remind me that there are still things worth fighting for, people worth protecting. Eliza's throat tightened. Thank you. For everything. He nodded once, then stood. We should rest while we can. Tomorrow we'll figure out how to find Mrs. Chen. That night, Eliza lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the boarding house settling around her. She thought about her mother, about the life that had been stolen from her. She thought about Samuel Garrett and the reckoning that was coming. And she thought about the words she'd spoken in the street, the truth she'd finally had the courage to say out loud. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was fighting back, and she wasn't going to stop until justice was done. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Sheriff Holland arrived at the boarding house just after breakfast, a telegram clutched in his hand and a grim smile on his face. Margaret ushered him into the sitting room where Eliza and Caleb were finishing their coffee. Judge Carson approved the exhumation, Holland said without preamble. We can proceed immediately. The county medical examiner is traveling from Millerton today. He'll be here by tonight, and will conduct the examination tomorrow morning. Eliza's cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down. That fast? Carson's known Garrett for years, doesn't trust him. When I laid out what you told me and mentioned the poison bottle, he expedited the order. Holland pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. There's more. I sent a deputy to the ranch yesterday to ask some questions. Talked to a few of the hands, the cook, some others. Most of them wouldn't say anything against Garrett, but one woman was different, said her name was Mrs. Chen. Eliza's breath caught. She talked to you? Not exactly. She wouldn't say much in front of the other hands, but she slipped my deputy a note when no one was looking. Holland pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to Eliza. She wants to talk, but she's afraid. Eliza unfolded the paper with shaking hands. The handwriting was careful and precise, the words written in English but with a formality that showed it wasn't Mrs. Chen's first language. I know the truth about Mrs. Catherine. I saw things. I will tell if someone keeps me safe. I cannot stay at ranch. He will know I talked. Please help me. I have nowhere to go. Eliza's eyes burned with tears. She saw. She knows. The question is, how do we get her out of there without Garrett finding out? Caleb said. If he suspects she's going to testify against him, he'll make sure she disappears. Holland nodded. That's the problem. The ranch is 10 miles south of here. Garrett's got men watching the roads. If we write an official, he'll know something's up. If we try to sneak her out and get caught, it could get ugly. What if she came here on her own? Margaret suggested. If she had a reason to come to town, something that wouldn't raise suspicion. Like what? Holland asked. Eliza thought for a moment, then straightened. Mrs. Chen used to come to town once a month to buy supplies for the kitchen, fabric and spices, things she couldn't get from the ranch stores. She'd take the wagon and spend most of the day here. When's she due to come next? I don't know. I lost track of time. Eliza looked at Margaret. Is there a dry goods store in town, somewhere she'd usually shop? Perkins' General Store, Margaret said. Let me go ask Albert if he remembers when she usually comes in. She hurried out, and they waited in tense silence. 5 minutes later, Margaret returned slightly out of breath. Albert says she comes the second Wednesday of every month. That's tomorrow. Holland leaned back in his chair, thinking. All right, so we wait for her to come to town, approach her at the store, and offer her protection. If she agrees to testify, we bring her here and keep her safe until the hearing. What if Garrett's men come with her? Caleb asked. Then we'll have to be careful. But most months, according to Albert, she comes alone. Garrett's never seen her as a threat. Holland stood. I'll have my deputies watching the roads tomorrow. If she shows up with company, we'll adjust. If she's alone, we move. After the sheriff left, Eliza paced the sitting room, too anxious to sit still. Mrs. Chen had been one of the few people at the ranch who'd shown her any kindness after her mother died. She'd brought Eliza extra food when Samuel locked her in her room, had whispered quiet words of comfort when no one else was listening. If anyone deserved protection, it was her. She's risking everything, Eliza said quietly. If Samuel finds out she wrote that note, if he suspects she'll testify. We won't let anything happen to her, Caleb said. He was cleaning his rifle by the window, his movements methodical and calm. Tomorrow, we get her to safety. Then we let the truth come out. That evening, the medical examiner arrived from Millerton. Dr. Harrison was a thin, serious man in his 60s with wire-rimmed spectacles and the careful manner of someone who'd spent his life dealing with death. Sheriff Holland brought him to the boarding house to meet Eliza and hear her account firsthand. Dr. Harrison listened without interruption as Eliza described her mother's symptoms, the timeline of her illness, and the discovery of the poison. When she finished, he asked a few pointed questions about her mother's medical history, then nodded. Based on what you've told me, chronic arsenic poisoning is entirely consistent with the symptoms. If your stepfather was administering small doses over several months, there should be significant accumulation in the tissue and bone. He cleaned his spectacles carefully. The examination will take several hours, but if arsenic is present, I'll find it. How soon will you know? Margaret asked. I'll conduct the examination tomorrow morning. Initial results should be available by afternoon. Full analysis will take longer, but I'll know enough to file a preliminary report by evening. And if you find arsenic? Eliza asked, her voice small. Then Sheriff Holland will have grounds for an arrest warrant, and you'll have the evidence you need to see justice done. Dr. Harrison's expression softened slightly. I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Monroe. No one should have to fight this hard for the truth. Eliza nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. The next morning dawned cold and gray. Eliza barely slept, her mind churning with possibilities and fears. What if Mrs. Chen didn't come? What if Garrett had already discovered the note? What if something went wrong? She dressed and went downstairs to find Margaret already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with nervous efficiency. Caleb sat at the table, coffee in hand, watching the street through the window. Any sign of her yet? Eliza asked. Too early. If she follows her usual pattern, she won't arrive until mid-morning. Caleb glanced at her. Eat something. You're going to need your strength. Eliza forced down some eggs and toast, though it tasted like ash in her mouth. The waiting was unbearable. She kept thinking about Dr. Harrison at the cemetery, about what he might find when he examined her mother's body. She kept thinking about Mrs. Chen making the long journey from the ranch, not knowing what awaited her. Around 10 o'clock, Sheriff Holland appeared at the door. She's here. Just pulled up to Perkins' store with the wagon. She's alone. Eliza's heart leaped. Can I go with you? Better if you don't, Holland said. She knows you, but seeing you might spook her. Let me approach first, make sure she understands she's safe. Then we'll bring her here. Eliza wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. She nodded and watched from the window as Holland crossed the street to the general store. Through the glass front, she could see Mrs. Chen inside, examining bolts of fabric. The sheriff entered casually, browsing the shelves, waiting for the right moment. Margaret came to stand beside Eliza, her hand resting gently on Eliza's shoulder. She'll be all right. Tom knows what he's doing. They watched as Holland approached Mrs. Chen. The older woman stiffened, her eyes going wide, but Holland spoke quietly, his posture unthreatening. After a moment, Mrs. Chen glanced toward the door, then nodded. Holland guided her outside, and together they walked across the street to the boarding house. Eliza met them at the door. Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears the moment she saw Eliza. Miss Eliza, you are safe. Thank heaven, you are safe. Mrs. Chen. Eliza took the older woman's hands, feeling how cold and trembling they were. Come inside, please. They settled in the sitting room and Margaret brought tea. Mrs. Chen held the cup in both hands, her whole body shaking. She was a small woman in her 50s, originally from China, who'd come to America as a young bride and lost her husband to a mining accident 10 years ago. She'd worked at the Monroe Ranch ever since, keeping to herself and doing her job with quiet efficiency. You wrote me a note, Holland said gently. You said you know the truth about what happened to Catherine Monroe. Mrs. Chen nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I should have spoken sooner. I should have stopped him, but I was afraid. I am still afraid. You're safe here, Margaret assured her. We won't let anything happen to you. Mrs. Chen looked at Eliza, her expression full of grief and guilt. Your mother was kind to me, always kind. When other people looked through me, she saw me. She asked about my life, my family in China. She treated me like a person, not just a servant. She spoke highly of you, Eliza said softly. She trusted you. I did not deserve her trust. I saw what he was doing, and I said nothing. Mrs. Chen's voice broke. I watched him make her tea every evening, always the same time, always from the same pot. He kept that pot locked in his study, brought it out only for her. One night, I saw him add something to it before he poured, a few drops from a small bottle. He did not know I was watching. Eliza's hands clenched. Did you see what was in the bottle? No, but after I went to his study when he was out, I found the bottle in his desk. It had no label, but it smelled wrong, like metal and bitter chemicals. I was afraid to take it, afraid he would know, but I wrote down what I saw, kept a record of the dates and times. Every time he gave her that tea, I wrote it down. Sheriff Holland leaned forward. You kept a record? Do you still have it? Mrs. Chen reached into her coat and pulled out a small cloth-bound notebook. Her hand shook as she handed it to him. Everything is here. 4 months of dates and notes. I knew it was wrong what he was doing, but I did not know how to stop it. I did not know who would believe a woman like me against a man like him. Holland opened the notebook and scanned the pages, his expression growing darker. This is detailed. Times, dates, observations about Mrs. Monroe's condition. This is evidence, Mrs. Chen. Powerful evidence. After Mrs. Catherine died, I thought maybe it was finished. Maybe he would stop. Mrs. Chen looked at Eliza, fresh tears flowing. But then I heard him talking to Mr. Burdock. Heard him say he would marry you off quickly, get you out of the way so no one could ask questions. I knew then that you were in danger. When you ran, I prayed you would find somewhere safe. And when the sheriff's deputy came asking questions, I knew I had to speak. You did the right thing, Eliza said, her own voice thick with emotion. You're doing the right thing now. Mrs. Chen shook her head. I should have done it sooner. I should have saved her. He would have killed you too, Margaret said firmly. Samuel Garrett is a dangerous man. You did what you had to do to survive. No one blames you for that. Holland closed the notebook carefully. Mrs. Chen, I need you to testify about what you saw. With this notebook and your testimony, combined with the medical examiner's findings and the poison bottle Miss Monroe found, we'll have a case strong enough to convict Garrett. But I need to know you're willing to stand up in court and tell the truth. Mrs. Chen's face was pale, but she nodded. I will testify. Mrs. Catherine deserves justice, and Miss Eliza deserves to be free of that man. Then you'll stay here with Margaret until the trial, Holland said. I'll post a deputy outside to make sure Garrett doesn't try anything. You're under the protection of the law now. Mrs. Chen looked around the room at the faces watching her with kindness and respect. For the first time since she'd arrived, some of the fear left her eyes. Thank you, all of you. That afternoon, Dr. Harrison completed his examination. Sheriff Holland brought him to the boarding house to deliver his findings in person. They gathered in the sitting room again, the air thick with tension. Dr. Harrison set his medical bag on the floor and removed his spectacles to clean them. I've completed the preliminary examination of Catherine Monroe's remains. The results are conclusive. He looked at Eliza, his expression grave. Your mother died of arsenic poisoning. The concentration in her tissue and bone indicates chronic exposure over a period of at least 4 to 6 months, possibly longer. Someone was administering small doses regularly, likely daily. Eliza closed her eyes, feeling the weight of confirmation settle over her. She'd known, but hearing it stated so clinically, so certainly, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Can you determine how it was administered? Holland asked. Most likely through food or drink. The pattern of accumulation suggests regular ingestion. Combined with Miss Monroe's testimony about the evening tea and Mrs. Chen's observations, I'd say that was the delivery method. Will your findings hold up in court? Absolutely. I'll prepare a full report with detailed analysis. Any competent medical professional will reach the same conclusion. Dr. Harrison put his spectacles back on. Samuel Garrett murdered his wife slowly and deliberately. There's no question about it. Holland stood. Then I'm issuing an arrest warrant. I'll take 2 deputies and ride out to the Garrett ranch immediately. Be careful, Caleb said. He's got 5 or 6 men out there, and they're loyal to his money. I know, but I've got the law on my side now, and hard evidence. If he resists, I'll bring in the federal marshal. Holland looked at Eliza. This is almost over, Miss Monroe. One way or another, Garrett's going to answer for what he did." They watched Holland leave, his stride purposeful and determined. Eliza sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. Mrs. Chen sat beside her and took her hand. "Your mother would be proud of you," the older woman said quietly. "You are braver than you know." "I'm not brave, I'm terrified." "Being brave does not mean you are not afraid. It means you do what is right, even when you are afraid." Mrs. Chen squeezed her hand. "You stood up to him. You told the truth. That takes great courage." Margaret brought more tea, and they sat in quiet companionship as the afternoon light faded. Caleb remained by the window watching the street, his rifle within easy reach. Despite the evidence, despite the arrest warrant, none of them believed Samuel Garrett would go quietly. As evening approached, a commotion erupted outside. Eliza rushed to the window and saw Sheriff Holland riding back into town, flanked by his deputies. Behind them, hands bound and face twisted with rage, rode Samuel Garrett. People poured out of their homes and businesses to watch as Holland led his prisoner down the main street to the jail. Samuel's eyes swept the crowd, and when they found the boarding house window where Eliza stood watching, they locked on her with pure hatred. "You'll pay for this," he shouted. "You'll all pay." Holland jerked the reins of Samuel's horse, forcing the man to look away. "Save it for the judge, Garrett." They disappeared into the jail, and slowly the crowd dispersed. Eliza stepped back from the window, her whole body trembling. It was done. Samuel Garrett was in custody. The evidence was overwhelming. Justice was finally within reach. But as she stood there in the fading light, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst wasn't over yet. That night, Eliza barely slept again. She kept replaying the moment Samuel's eyes had found hers, the rage and malice in his expression. Men like him didn't accept defeat gracefully. Even behind bars, he'd find a way to lash out. The next morning brought more news. Sheriff Holland arrived looking grim. "Garrett made bail," he said without preamble. "Judge Carson set it high, but Garrett had the money. He's out." Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. "He's out? How can he be out?" "The law's the law, Miss Monroe. He's not a flight risk, and he hasn't been convicted yet. He's ordered to remain in the county and check in with my office daily until the trial." Holland's jaw tightened. "I don't like it any more than you do, but my hands are tied." "What about Mrs. Chen? What about me? We're witnesses. He could—" "I know what he could do. That's why I've got deputies watching this house around the clock. And I've made it very clear to Garrett that if anything happens to either of you, he'll be the first person I come for." Holland paused. "The trial's been set for 2 weeks from now. Until then, you stay here, stay safe, and let the law do its work." After he left, Margaret bolted the doors and drew the curtains. Mrs. Chen retreated to her room, her earlier courage replaced by visible fear. Caleb checked and rechecked every window, every door, every possible entry point. "He won't try anything obvious," Caleb said. "Not with deputies watching, but we stay alert anyway." The days that followed were tense and claustrophobic. Eliza felt like a prisoner in the boarding house, watching the street through gaps in the curtains, jumping at every sound. She saw Samuel twice, riding past slowly on his horse, his eyes fixed on the house like he could see through the walls. But he didn't approach. He didn't try anything. He simply waited. The trial began on a cold Monday morning 2 weeks after his arrest. The courthouse was packed with spectators, drawn by the scandal and the drama. Eliza sat in the front row with Margaret on one side and Caleb on the other, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Samuel sat at the defense table with his lawyer, a slick man from Millerton named Dalton, who specialized in defending wealthy clients. He looked confident, almost bored, like this was just another case he'd win through money and influence. Judge Carson called the court to order, and the prosecutor, a stern woman named Helena Marsh, presented the case. She was methodical and thorough, laying out the evidence piece by piece. The poison bottle, analyzed and confirmed as arsenic. Dr. Harrison's testimony about the autopsy findings and the evidence of chronic poisoning. Eliza's testimony about discovering the bottle and witnessing her mother's decline. When Eliza took the stand, she felt Samuel's eyes boring into her. But she didn't look at him. She looked at Judge Carson and told the truth, clearly and calmly, answering every question the prosecutor asked. Then came Mrs. Chen's testimony. The older woman was terrified, her voice shaking as she described what she'd seen. But she didn't waver. She presented her notebook, explained her observations, and confirmed that Samuel Garrett had been adding something to Catherine Monroe's tea for months before she died. Dalton tried to discredit her during cross-examination, suggesting she was a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, that her English wasn't good enough to understand what she'd seen, that her notebook could have been fabricated. But Mrs. Chen held firm, her quiet dignity and obvious sincerity more powerful than any of his attacks. The trial lasted 3 days. When it was finally time for closing arguments, Prosecutor Marsh stood and addressed the jury with quiet intensity. Samuel Garrett murdered his wife for money and control. He poisoned her slowly, carefully, so no one would suspect. And when his stepdaughter discovered the truth, he tried to silence her too. The evidence is overwhelming. The testimony is clear. Catherine Monroe deserves justice, and you, the jury, have the power to give it to her. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, their faces were solemn. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Carson asked. The foreman stood. "We have, Your Honor. We find the defendant, Samuel Garrett, guilty of murder in the first degree." The courtroom erupted. Samuel lunged to his feet, shouting denials and threats, but the bailiffs restrained him. Judge Carson slammed his gavel, calling for order. Eliza sat frozen, tears streaming down her face. Beside her, Margaret was crying too, and Mrs. Chen had her face in her hands. Caleb's hand found Eliza's and squeezed gently. "It's over," he said quietly. "It's really over." Judge Carson sentenced Samuel Garrett to hang. The execution was scheduled for 1 month later, time enough for appeals that everyone knew would fail. As the bailiffs led Samuel away in chains, he looked back one last time at Eliza. This time, there was no rage in his eyes, only defeat. Eliza walked out of the courthouse into bright afternoon sunshine, feeling like she was stepping into a new world. The weight she'd carried for so long, the fear and anger and grief, didn't disappear completely, but it shifted, becoming something she could finally carry without it crushing her. "Your mother can rest now," Margaret said, putting an arm around her shoulders. Eliza nodded, unable to speak past the tears, but for the first time since her mother died, they were tears of relief. Justice had been done. The week after the trial, Eliza stood in the doorway of her old ranch house for the first time in nearly 2 months. The place looked different now, smaller somehow, stripped of the menace it had held when Samuel Garrett walked these halls. Sheriff Holland had accompanied her, along with Caleb and Margaret, to help her sort through her mother's belongings and decide what to do with the property. The house was quiet, almost tomb-like. Most of Samuel's hired men had scattered after the verdict, unwilling to be associated with a convicted murderer. Only old Henry, the stable hand who'd worked for Eliza's real father, had stayed behind to tend the horses and keep the place from falling into complete neglect. "Take your time," Margaret said gently, touching Eliza's shoulder. "There's no rush." Eliza nodded and stepped inside. The sitting room looked exactly as it had the night she'd fled, though dust had settled over everything. She moved through the house slowly, each room holding memories both precious and painful. Her mother's sewing basket still sat by the window where she'd left it. Her father's books lined the study shelves. The locked room where Samuel had kept her prisoner stood open now, the keys still in the lock. She climbed the stairs to her mother's bedroom. The bed was neatly made, untouched since Catherine's death. Eliza sat on the edge of the mattress and let herself remember her mother as she'd been before the sickness, before Samuel. Strong and kind, with laugh lines around her eyes and capable hands that could gentle a spooked horse or braid Eliza's hair with equal skill. "I got justice for you, Mama," Eliza whispered to the empty room. "He can't hurt anyone else now." She opened her mother's wardrobe and found the cedar box where Catherine had kept her most treasured possessions. Inside were letters from Eliza's father, a pressed flower from their wedding day, and a small portrait of Eliza as a child. At the bottom, wrapped in silk, was Catherine's wedding ring from her first marriage, the one to Eliza's father. Samuel had made her remove it when they married, but she'd kept it hidden all these years. Eliza slipped the ring onto her own finger. It was slightly too large, but she could have it sized. She wanted to carry this piece of her mother with her, this symbol of real love untainted by Samuel's poison. In her father's study, she found his journals and ledgers documenting years of ranch management. She'd need to go through these carefully, figure out the state of the property and what needed to be done. The ranch was legally hers now, passed down from her mother, but Eliza wasn't sure she wanted to keep it. Too many bad memories haunted these walls. Caleb found her there an hour later, surrounded by papers and lost in thought. "You all right?" he asked from the doorway. "I'm deciding what comes next," Eliza said, gesturing at the ledgers. "The ranch is mine, but I don't know if I can live here. Every room reminds me of what he did, what he took from us." Caleb stepped into the study and sat down across from her. "You don't have to decide today, or even this month. Take the time you need to figure out what you want. What I want is to start over, to build a life that's mine, not something I inherited from tragedy." Eliza closed the ledger in front of her. "Margaret offered me a job at the boarding house, room and board plus wages. It's not much, but it's honest work, and it would give me independence." "That sounds like a good start. What about you?" The question came out before Eliza could stop it. "Will you go back to writing roots? Back to being alone?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "I've been thinking about that. I've spent 4 years running from my grief, convincing myself that being alone was easier than risking more loss. But these past weeks with you and Margaret, being part of something that mattered, helping bring a guilty man to justice." He met her eyes. "It reminded me that isolation isn't the same as peace. Maybe it's time I stopped running." "What would you do instead?" "Redstone Crossing could use a good ranch hand. Margaret mentioned the Carlson place is looking for help, and they're good people. I could settle there, find some stability." He paused. "Stay close to people who've become important to me." Eliza's heart beat faster. "I'm glad you're staying. So am I." They spent the rest of the day sorting through the house. Eliza packed her mother's most precious belongings, her father's journals, and a few pieces of furniture she wanted to keep. Everything else could be sold with the ranch when she was ready. By evening, they'd loaded 2 wagons with what Eliza wanted to take back to Redstone Crossing. Before they left, Eliza walked out to the small cemetery where her parents were buried. Her father's grave was marked with a simple headstone, weathered by years of prairie wind. Her mother's was newer, the earth still fresh. Samuel had arranged a plain marker with just her name and dates, nothing about who she'd been or who had loved her. Eliza knelt beside the grave, her mother's wedding ring catching the last light of day. "I'm leaving this place, Mama. I'm going to build a new life, the kind of life you would have wanted for me. Free and full of choices I make myself." She touched the cold stone gently. "I love you. I'll always love you, and I promise I'll live enough for both of us." The wind whispered through the grass, and Eliza imagined it was her mother's voice, giving her blessing. The journey back to Redstone Crossing felt different than the desperate flight that had brought her here. This time, Eliza rode with her head up, watching the prairie unfold around her without fear. Mrs. Chen sat in the wagon beside Margaret, the 2 women talking quietly about plans for the boarding house. Caleb rode alongside, steady and present. When they reached town just after sunset, several people came out to greet them. Word of the trial and verdict had spread, and the town had embraced both Eliza and Mrs. Chen as their own. Albert from the general store waved from his porch. Dr. Morrison, who'd treated Eliza for exhaustion after the trial, called out a friendly greeting. Even Judge Carson, who'd stayed in town a few extra days, tipped his hat as they passed. "You've made quite an impression on this place," Margaret said with a smile. "They're proud of what you did, standing up to Garrett the way you did. You showed real courage. I was terrified the entire time. Courage isn't the absence of fear, dear. It's acting despite it. You faced your fear and won." They unloaded the wagons at the boarding house, and Margaret showed Mrs. Chen to a permanent room on the 2nd floor. The older woman had agreed to stay on as Margaret's assistant, helping with cooking and housekeeping in exchange for room, board, and a small salary. It was the first time in years she'd had true security, and the relief on her face was visible. That night, Margaret prepared a celebratory dinner, inviting Sheriff Holland and his wife, along with Dr. Harrison, who was staying in town for a few more days. They gathered around the large dining table, and for the first time since her mother's death, Eliza felt something close to happiness. "To justice," Sheriff Holland said, raising his glass, "and to brave women who refuse to be silenced." They all drank to that, and conversation flowed easily. Holland told stories about past cases, some funny, some sobering. Dr. Harrison discussed medical advances happening in the eastern cities. Margaret and Mrs. Chen talked about expanding the boarding house's services, maybe adding a small restaurant. Caleb sat beside Eliza, quiet as always, but present. At one point, their eyes met across the table, and he smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and softened the hard lines of his face. After dinner, Eliza and Caleb walked out onto the front porch. The night was cool and clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. The town was peaceful, windows glowing with warm light, the sound of a piano drifting from the saloon down the street. "This is a good place," Caleb said, leaning against the porch rail. "It is. I think I could be happy here." "You deserve to be happy, Eliza. After everything you've been through, you deserve a life that's yours." She looked at him. This man who'd given her shelter when she had nowhere to go, who'd protected her without asking for anything in return, who'd stood beside her through the darkest moments of her life. "I was so afraid of you that first night," she said quietly. "Standing outside your cabin in the rain, not knowing if you'd help me or hurt me. I remember the exact moment you opened the door, and I saw your face, and I thought, this is it. This is where my story ends." But it wasn't. No. It was where my story began. The real story, the one I get to write myself. She turned to face him fully. "You saved my life, Caleb. Not just by taking me in, but by helping me find the courage to fight back. I don't know how to thank you for that. You don't need to thank me. Seeing you stand up in that courtroom, watching you take back your life, that was thanks enough." He paused, seeming to struggle with something. "Eliza, I need to tell you something. When I first met you, I saw someone who needed help, and I couldn't walk away from that. But somewhere along the way, it became more than duty or decency. You reminded me what it felt like to care about someone, to want to protect them not because you had to, but because you couldn't imagine not doing it." Eliza's breath caught. "Caleb, let me finish. I'm not good with words, and I need to get this out." He took a breath. "I lost my family 4 years ago, and I thought that was it for me. Thought I'd spend the rest of my life alone, keeping everyone at arm's length because it was safer that way. But you changed that. You made me remember that life isn't just about being safe. It's about connection, about fighting for the people you care about building something that matters." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I care about you, Eliza. More than I probably should, more than I plan to. And I know you're just starting to build your new life and you don't need complications. But I wanted you to know that whatever you decide, wherever you go, I'll be here. Not as someone who saved you, but as someone who believes in you and wants to see you thrive." Eliza felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears this time. "You didn't save me, Caleb. You gave me a chance to save myself. There's a difference, and it matters." She stepped closer. "I care about you too. You're the first person who's ever looked at me and seen someone strong enough to fight, not someone who needed to be controlled or protected or managed. You trusted me to be brave, and that trust meant everything. So what happens now? Now I build the life I want. I work at the boarding house, figure out what to do with the ranch, learn who I am when I'm not afraid." She reached out and took his hand. "And I'd like you to be part of that life, if you want to be. Not as my protector or my savior, but as my friend. And maybe, eventually, as something more." Caleb's hand closed around hers, warm and steady. "I'd like that very much." They stood together on the porch, watching the stars and listening to the quiet sounds of the town settling in for the night. It wasn't a dramatic moment, no grand declarations or sweeping gestures. It was simple and real, and exactly what both of them needed. The weeks that followed brought new rhythms and routines. Eliza threw herself into work at the boarding house, learning the business from Margaret and proving herself capable and reliable. She was good with the guests, especially the women traveling alone who appreciated her quiet strength and understanding. Mrs. Chen taught her to cook traditional dishes from China, and they spent long evenings in the kitchen, talking and laughing while they worked. Caleb took the job at the Carlson Ranch and proved to be as skilled with cattle and horses as he'd been on the trail. The Carlsons appreciated his steady work ethic and quiet competence, and within a month they'd offered him a permanent position with a small cabin on their property. He spent his evenings in town, often at the boarding house, helping with repairs and becoming a familiar presence. 1 month after the trial, on the day of Samuel Garrett's scheduled execution, Eliza woke early and rode out to her mother's grave. She'd commissioned a new headstone, one that told the truth about who Catherine Monroe had been. Catherine Elizabeth Monroe, beloved wife and mother. Her kindness was her strength, her love was her legacy. Eliza placed fresh wildflowers on the grave and sat in the grass, letting herself remember. Not the painful months of illness, but the years before. Her mother teaching her to ride, to read, to see the beauty in prairie sunsets. Her mother's laugh, her gentle hands, her fierce protection of those she loved. "He's gone now, Mama," Eliza said quietly. "They hanged him this morning. It's really over." She stayed until the sun was high, thinking about justice and closure and what it meant to move forward. Samuel Garrett was dead, executed for his crimes, and while Eliza didn't feel joy at his death, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The man who'd killed her mother and tried to destroy her life was gone. He couldn't hurt anyone else ever again. When she returned to town, she found Margaret and Mrs. Chen in the kitchen, preparing lunch for the boarding house guests. They looked up when she entered, concern evident on their faces. "How are you feeling?" Margaret asked. "Lighter," Eliza said honestly. "Like I can finally breathe all the way. It's strange, isn't it? He's been dead less than a day, but already the world feels different." Mrs. Chen nodded. "Evil leaves a shadow. When it is removed, the light can return." That evening, Margaret threw a small dinner party to mark the unofficial end of the ordeal. It was just the core group who'd been there from the beginning. Eliza, Caleb, Mrs. Chen, Sheriff Holland and his wife, and Dr. Harrison, who'd returned to Millerton but come back for the occasion. "To new beginnings," Margaret said, raising her glass. They drank to that, and the conversation was lighter than it had been in weeks. Stories were told, plans were made. Sheriff Holland mentioned that the ranch was showing interest from several potential buyers, families looking for good land to settle. Dr. Harrison talked about a young doctor looking to establish a practice in a small town, someone who might be a good fit for Redstone Crossing. As the night wore on and guests began to leave, Eliza found herself alone with Caleb on the porch again. It had become their spot, this quiet space where they could talk without pretense. "How are you really feeling?" Caleb asked. "About today. About everything." Eliza thought about it carefully. "I thought I'd feel relieved when it was over. And I do, partly. But mostly, I just feel tired, like I've been running for so long that I don't quite know how to stop. That'll come with time. You don't heal from something like this overnight." "I know, but I'm ready to start trying." She looked at him. "I've been thinking about the ranch. I'm going to sell it. Use the money to buy into the boarding house as Margaret's partner. She's been wanting to expand, maybe buy the building next door and turn it into a proper restaurant. With my investment, we could make it happen." "It sounds like a solid plan. You'd be good at running a business." "I hope so. I want to build something that's mine, something that helps people the way Margaret helped me. Women traveling alone, families passing through, people who need a safe place to rest." She paused. "And I want to create jobs. Mrs. Chen deserves security, and there are other women in this territory who could use honest work and fair wages." "You're thinking big." "I spent 18 years thinking small, letting other people define what I could be and do. I'm done with that." She turned to face him fully. "What about you? Are you happy at the Carlson place?" "I am. It's good work with good people, and it feels right to be settled somewhere." He smiled slightly. "And being close to town has its advantages." "Such as?" "Such as being able to see you every day." Eliza felt warmth spread through her chest. Over the past weeks, she and Caleb had grown closer, but they'd moved slowly, both of them learning to trust again. There had been no grand romantic gestures, just quiet moments of connection, hands touching as they worked side by side, conversations that stretched late into the night, the steady building of something real. "Caleb," she said softly, "I need you to know something. When I said I wanted you to be part of my life, I meant it. But I also need you to understand that I'm not looking for someone to take care of me or make decisions for me. I spent too long being controlled. I know, and I wouldn't want to be that person anyway. What I want is to be your partner, your equal, someone who stands beside you, not in front of you or behind you. He took her hand. I want to build a life with you, Eliza. Not my life that you fit into, and not your life that I'm just visiting, our life, together. Tears filled her eyes, but she was smiling. I want that too. He pulled her close, and she went willingly, resting her head against his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart. For the first time in her life, being held by someone felt safe and right instead of suffocating. I love you, she whispered. I don't know when it happened, but I do. I love you too, he said into her hair. I think I have since that first night when you stood in the rain looking terrified but refusing to give up. They stood together on the porch as the stars came out, two people who'd found each other in the darkness and chosen to walk toward the light together. The months that followed brought growth and change. Eliza and Margaret finalized the partnership and the boarding house expansion began. They hired 2 local women to help with the increased workload, and Mrs. Chen trained them in cooking and hospitality. The restaurant opened in late fall to enthusiastic business, becoming a gathering place for the town. The ranch sold to a young family from Kansas, the Hendersons, who had 3 children and dreams of building a life on the prairie. Eliza met with them before the sale was finalized, walking them through the property and telling them about her father's legacy, about the good years before Samuel Garrett arrived. My father loved this land, she told Mr. Henderson as they stood looking out over the pastures. He built something good here, something worth preserving. I hope you and your family will be happy here. Mr. Henderson, a kind-faced man with calloused hands and honest eyes, nodded seriously. We'll take good care of it, Miss Monroe. I promise you that. And Eliza believed him. Watching the Henderson children run through the fields, hearing their laughter echo in spaces that had been silent for too long, she felt a sense of peace. The ranch would be a home again, filled with life and love instead of fear and control. With the money from the sale, Eliza and Margaret purchased the building next door and began renovations. They hired local craftsmen, created jobs, and invested in the community. The restaurant, which they named Catherine's Table in honor of Eliza's mother, became known throughout the territory for its excellent food and warm hospitality. Mrs. Chen became the head chef, bringing her skill and creativity to every dish. She trained other women in the culinary arts, passing on knowledge and creating opportunities. She also began teaching English classes in the evenings, helping new immigrants navigate their adopted home. Caleb continued working at the Carlson Ranch, but spent most of his free time in town. He and Eliza courted properly, with walks along the creek, dinners at the boarding house, and long conversations about their hopes and dreams. The whole town watched their relationship bloom, offering knowing smiles and quiet approval. One evening in December, nearly 6 months after Eliza had first stumbled to Caleb's door in the rain, he took her to the place where the creek widened into a small pond. The water was still, reflecting the winter sunset in shades of orange and pink. Snow dusted the ground, and their breath formed clouds in the cold air. I wanted to bring you here, Caleb said, because this is where I came the day after I buried my wife and daughter. I stood right here and decided I was done living. Not that I'd kill myself, but that I'd just exist, going through the motions without really being alive. Eliza took his hand, saying nothing, letting him continue. I told myself it was easier that way, safer. If I didn't let anyone in, I couldn't lose anyone else. I spent 4 years convincing myself that isolation was strength, that being alone was the same as being independent. He turned to look at her. But then you happened. And you reminded me that life is worth living, even when it's hard, even when it hurts. You showed me that courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about being afraid and moving forward anyway. He pulled a small box from his pocket, and Eliza's breath caught. Eliza Monroe, you are the bravest person I've ever met. You faced your worst fear and won. You took your life back and built something beautiful from the ashes. You could have let what happened to you make you hard and bitter, but instead you chose kindness. You chose to help others, to create opportunities, to make the world better. He opened the box, revealing a simple gold band with a small blue stone. I would be honored, more honored than I can say, if you'd let me spend the rest of my life standing beside you. Will you marry me? Tears streamed down Eliza's face, but she was smiling wider than she ever had. Yes, yes, absolutely yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and she threw her arms around his neck, laughing and crying at the same time. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her around while the sunset painted the sky in colors that seemed impossibly bright. When he set her down, she cupped his face in her hands. I was so afraid of you that first night, and now I can't imagine my life without you. You never have to, he promised. I'm not going anywhere. Neither am I, she said. We're building something together, Caleb, something real and lasting, and I've never been more sure of anything in my life. They stood together by the pond as darkness fell, making plans and dreaming dreams, two souls who'd found each other in the storm and chosen to build a shelter together. The wedding took place in the spring, when wildflowers covered the prairie and the air smelled of new grass and possibility. They married in the garden behind the boarding house, surrounded by everyone who'd helped them through the darkness. Margaret stood as Eliza's witness, tears streaming down her face throughout the ceremony. Mrs. Chen prepared a feast that brought together flavors from 3 continents, a celebration of cultures and connections. Sheriff Holland gave a toast about justice and new beginnings, about how sometimes the hardest fights lead to the sweetest victories. Dr. Harrison, who'd made the journey from Millerton, spoke about healing and resilience. Even old Henry from the ranch came, bringing news that the Henderson family was thriving and that the land was being cared for with love. Eliza wore a simple white dress that Margaret had helped her make, with lace from her mother's wedding gown sewn into the bodice. She wore her mother's wedding ring on a chain around her neck, keeping Catherine close to her heart. As she and Caleb spoke their vows, she felt her mother's presence, felt her approval and pride. I promise to stand beside you, Caleb said, his voice steady and sure. Not in front of you to shield you, and not behind you to push you. Beside you, as your equal and your partner. I promise to trust your strength, to support your dreams, and to love you with everything I have for as long as I live. Eliza's voice shook slightly, but her words were clear. I promise to build a life with you, not around you. I promise to share my fears and my hopes, to let you in when it's hard, and celebrate with you when it's good. I promise to choose you every day, the way you chose me that stormy night when you opened your door to a stranger. You gave me shelter, and together we've built a home. When they kissed, the assembled guests cheered and applauded. The celebration lasted long into the night, with music and dancing and laughter that echoed across the prairie. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, Eliza and Caleb slipped away to the porch, their special spot, one last time before heading to the small house Caleb had built on the edge of town. Mrs. Ward, Caleb said, testing out her new name. How does it sound? Perfect, Eliza said, leaning against his shoulder. Though I've been thinking, what if we keep both names, Eliza Monroe Ward? That way I honor where I came from while embracing where I'm going. I like that, Caleb said. It's very you, independent and traditional all at once. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars come out one by one. Do you ever think about that night? Eliza asked quietly. The storm, the cabin, how everything could have gone so differently? All the time, Caleb admitted. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I hadn't opened the door. If I'd been somewhere else, if you'd ridden past in the dark. I think about all the ways we might have missed each other. But we didn't. No, we didn't, and I'm grateful for that every single day. Eliza looked up at the stars, thinking about fate and choice and all the moments that had led her here. My mother used to say that the prairie teaches you to be strong because there's nowhere to hide. You face the storm or you die. I used to think that was harsh, but now I understand. Sometimes the only way through is straight ahead, even when you're terrified. You faced your storm, Caleb said, and you came through it stronger. We both did, Eliza corrected. We faced it together. The years that followed were full and rich. Eliza and Caleb built their life with intention and care, creating a home that was warm and welcoming. They had 3 children over the next 5 years, 2 daughters and a son, and raised them with love and respect, and the understanding that strength came from choosing yourself, not from controlling others. The boarding house and restaurant continued to thrive. Margaret and Eliza worked side by side, creating a business that was known throughout the territory for its quality and its heart. They employed dozens of women over the years, offering fair wages and safe working conditions. Many of their employees were like Mrs. Chen had been, women who needed a second chance or a safe harbor from difficult circumstances. Mrs. Chen became like a grandmother to Eliza's children, teaching them to cook and sharing stories about her homeland. She lived to be 83, passing peacefully in her sleep with her chosen family around her. Her funeral was attended by over 100 people whose lives she'd touched, and Eliza cried for the loss of the woman who'd been brave enough to speak the truth when it mattered most. Sheriff Holland retired after 20 years of service, and when the town held a celebration in his honor, he told the story of Eliza's case, calling it the most important work he'd ever done. Justice isn't just about punishing the guilty, he said. It's about protecting the innocent and giving them the chance to build the lives they deserve. The ranch continued to flourish under the Hendersons' stewardship. Eliza visited occasionally, bringing her children to see where their grandfather had lived and worked. She told them stories about her father's kindness, her mother's strength, and the legacy they'd left behind. She also told them the truth about Samuel Garrett, about what he'd done and how she'd fought back, because she believed that children needed to understand that sometimes good people had to be brave in the face of evil. Caleb worked at the Carlson Ranch for 10 years before deciding to start his own business, training horses and teaching horsemanship. He had a gift for working with troubled animals, the same patience and understanding he'd shown Eliza that first night. His reputation spread, and soon people were bringing horses from 3 territories away for him to work with. On their 10th anniversary, Caleb surprised Eliza with a trip to the pond where he'd proposed. The children stayed with Margaret, and they spent the weekend in the small cabin Caleb had built there, talking and laughing and remembering all the ways their lives had changed. "Do you have any regrets?" Caleb asked as they sat by the water on their last evening. Eliza thought about it carefully. She thought about her mother, about the years stolen by Samuel Garrett's cruelty. She thought about the fear and the pain and the long road to justice. "I regret that my mother didn't live to see this," she said finally. "I regret the life she could have had if Samuel hadn't poisoned her. But I don't regret fighting back. I don't regret telling the truth, or standing up in that courtroom, or any of the hard choices I made along the way. Those choices led me here, to this life with you, and I wouldn't trade that for anything. Not even for a life where you never had to be afraid." "Fear taught me courage," Eliza said. "Without the darkness, I wouldn't appreciate the light. Without the storm, I wouldn't have found your cabin. Without losing my mother, I wouldn't have learned how strong I really am." She took his hand. "I wouldn't choose the pain, but I've made peace with it. It's part of my story, but it doesn't define me anymore." "What defines you now?" Eliza smiled. "Choice, love. The family we've built and the life we've created, the women we've helped and the community we're part of. I'm defined by what I've built, not by what was done to me." Caleb pulled her close, and they watched the sun set over the pond, painting the water in shades of gold and rose. 20 years after that first stormy night, Eliza stood in the garden of the boarding house, now a thriving hotel and restaurant complex, watching her oldest daughter get married. Catherine, named for her grandmother, was strong and independent, with Eliza's determination and Caleb's steady calm. She was marrying a teacher from back east, a man who respected her intelligence and supported her dreams of opening a school. As Eliza watched her daughter speak her vows, she thought about legacy and the ways love ripples forward through generations. Her mother had loved her fiercely, and that love had given Eliza the courage to run. Margaret had opened her home and her heart, showing Eliza what chosen family meant. Mrs. Chen had risked everything to tell the truth, proving that courage came in many forms. And Caleb had opened his door on a stormy night, choosing compassion over caution, and in doing so had saved not just Eliza's life, but his own. All of these acts of love and courage had led to this moment, to Eliza's daughter standing in the sunshine promising her life to someone who would cherish her. After the ceremony, Margaret, now in her 70s but still sharp and energetic, pulled Eliza aside. "Your mother would be so proud," she said, echoing words she'd spoken many times over the years. "Look at everything you've built. The business, the family, the life. You took the worst thing that ever happened to you and turned it into something beautiful." I had help, Eliza said, squeezing Margaret's hand. I couldn't have done any of it without you. Maybe, but you were the one who had the courage to knock on a stranger's door in the middle of a storm. You were the one who stood up in that courtroom and demanded justice. You were the one who chose to build instead of breaking down. Margaret's eyes were bright with tears. You chose courage, Eliza, again and again and again. That's what made all the difference. That night, after the guests had left and the children were asleep, Eliza and Caleb sat on their porch, as they had countless times before. The prairie stretched out before them, peaceful under the stars. Do you ever think about where we'd be if I hadn't run that night? Eliza asked. If I'd stayed at the ranch, married Thomas Burdock like Samuel wanted? You wouldn't have stayed, Caleb said with certainty. You're too strong for that. You would have found another way, another time. Maybe, but I'm glad it happened the way it did. I'm glad the storm brought me to your door. So am I. Caleb took her hand, their fingers interlacing in a gesture as familiar as breathing. You know what I think about sometimes? I think about all the people out there right now who are in the situation you were in. Trapped, afraid, not sure if they're strong enough to run. I wish I could tell them what I've learned from watching you all these years. What's that? That courage isn't something you're born with. It's something you choose moment by moment, even when you're terrified. That running towards something better isn't cowardice, it's survival. And that asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. He looked at her. You taught me all of that. Eliza leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady presence that had anchored her for 2 decades. We taught each other. You showed me that not all men are like Samuel Garrett, that kindness and strength can exist in the same person, that love doesn't have to mean control. They sat in comfortable silence, 2 people who'd walked through fire and come out the other side hand in hand. Years later, when Eliza was an old woman with silver hair and grandchildren who climbed on her lap, she would tell this story. She'd tell it to young women who came to the hotel looking for work, running from their own Samuel Garretts. She'd tell it to her grandchildren, who needed to understand that their grandmother had been brave in ways that mattered. She'd tell them about the storm and the cabin and the stranger who'd opened his door. She'd tell them about Margaret's kindness and Mrs. Chen's courage and Sheriff Holland's justice. She'd tell them about standing in a courtroom and speaking truth to power, about watching a murderer brought to justice, about the long road to healing. But most of all, she'd tell them about choice, about how every day she'd chosen to keep going, chosen to tell the truth, chosen to build something good from the ashes of tragedy, chosen love over fear, hope over despair, courage over comfort. I was afraid, she'd tell them, her voice still strong even in old age. I was so afraid I could barely breathe. But I did the thing that scared me anyway. I knocked on that door, I told my story, I demanded justice, and every single time I was afraid, I made the choice to be brave anyway. And that, she'd conclude, made all the difference. On a spring morning, many years after that first stormy night, Eliza woke to birdsong and sunshine streaming through her bedroom window. Caleb was still asleep beside her, his face peaceful in the early light. She could hear her grandchildren playing in the yard, their laughter carrying through the open window. She got up quietly and went to the window, looking out over the town she'd helped build, the life she'd chosen. The hotel stood proud and prosperous. The restaurant was already showing signs of activity as Mrs. Chen's successor prepared for the breakfast rush. The schoolhouse Catherine had founded rang with the voices of children learning. Everything she could see was the result of choices made in fear and love and courage. Every building, every relationship, every dream realized was proof that running towards something better wasn't cowardice. It was the bravest thing a person could do. Eliza touched the window frame, the same gesture she'd made thousands of times over the years, and smiled. She'd been afraid that night in the storm. She'd been terrified, actually, shaking so hard she could barely stay on the horse. But she'd done it anyway. And that choice, that single moment of desperate courage, had changed everything. Behind her, Caleb stirred and reached for her. She turned from the window and went to him, sliding back into bed and into his arms. He pulled her close, still half asleep, and she felt the same sense of safety and love she'd felt every day for the past 40 years. "Love you," he mumbled against her hair. "Love you too," she whispered back. Outside, The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the memory of a storm, a desperate ride, and a door opening in the darkness. Carrying with it the echo of words spoken in fear and answered with kindness. "I'm afraid of you," she'd said. "I've got you," he'd answered, and he had, and she'd held on. And together they'd built a life worth living. The end.